My beloved child. Do not scroll past this moment. Pause here, because something has been building quietly behind the scenes, and the person connected to your heart is closer to speaking than you realize. What you are about to hear was not created to frighten you, but to bring you into a moment of clarity. There are times when silence means distance, and there are times when silence means someone is gathering every ounce of courage they have because the next words they speak could change everything. This is one of those moments. Your soulmate wants to talk to you right now, and the urgency is not coming from panic. It is coming from a truth they can no longer comfortably carry alone. Something has shifted inside them. For longer than you know, they have been rehearsing a conversation that never seemed to arrive at the right moment. They have imagined how you might respond. They have pictured your face when you finally hear what has been hidden beneath their hesitation. They have started sentences in their mind, erased them, rebuilt them, and then gone silent again. But now the silence is becoming heavier than the truth itself. There is a reason this message is finding you while their heart is reaching a turning point. The next chapter cannot be entered through guessing, assumptions, or unfinished conversations. Something must finally be said. You may have noticed the energy changing before you could explain why. Perhaps you thought of them unexpectedly. Perhaps an old memory returned with unusual intensity. Perhaps you found yourself wondering why something between you still felt unfinished even after you tried to convince yourself that you had moved beyond it. Do not mistake every memory for a sign, my child, but do not ignore what your own heart has been trying to understand either. Sometimes unresolved feelings remain because no honest conversation ever gave them somewhere to rest. And right now, there is a conversation waiting at the edge of this connection. Your soulmate has been carrying words that were never spoken when they should have been. Some of those words are apologies. Some are explanations. Some are admissions they were afraid would make them appear vulnerable. And one of them is a truth that they once believed they could keep buried without consequence. That is where the urgency begins. They are realizing that whatever they refuse to say may soon become the very thing that separates them permanently from the possibility of being understood by you. Listen carefully, because this is where the story becomes deeper. They are not simply thinking, "I miss you." Their heart is wrestling with something far more complicated. They have been asking themselves whether they lost your trust before they ever understood how valuable it was. They are wondering whether they misread your silence. They once believed that if you truly cared, you would keep reaching for them no matter how confusing their behavior became. But something has changed. They have begun to understand that your silence may not have been indifference at all. It may have been the moment you finally stopped carrying a relationship that required you to do all the emotional lifting. That realization has unsettled them. For the first time, they are seeing certain memories from your perspective. Moments they once dismissed now feel painfully clear. The time you tried to explain how you felt and they changed the subject. The moment you waited for reassurance and received uncertainty instead. The days when you gave them patience while quietly wondering whether they would ever meet you with the same honesty. They remember more than you think. And now those memories are returning without the excuses they once used to protect themselves. Something happened recently inside their world. It may not have looked dramatic from the outside, but emotionally it created a crack in the story they had been telling themselves. Someone may have said something that reminded them of you. They may have witnessed another person receive the kind of loyalty they once took for granted. They may have looked back through an old message, heard a familiar song, seen a place connected to you, or simply found themselves sitting alone with no distraction strong enough to silence the truth. Whatever opened that door, once it opened, something they had avoided stepped through. They realized you were never asking for perfection. You were asking for sincerity. That is the part they misunderstood. They thought they needed the perfect timing, the perfect explanation, the perfect version of themselves before speaking honestly. So they postponed. They hesitated. They waited for certainty. But in waiting, they created distance. And now they understand that sometimes love does not disappear because people stop caring. Sometimes love becomes wounded because people wait too long to say the things that mattered when they had the chance. My child, do not confuse urgency with a command to abandon your boundaries. Heaven does not ask you to surrender wisdom just because someone suddenly feels ready to speak. Your heart is precious, and any conversation worth having must make room for truth, accountability, and respect. But there is something important you need to know before this story goes further. Your soulmate is not preparing to speak because everything in their life has become easy. They are preparing to speak because keeping quiet has finally become harder. There is a difference. For a long time, fear controlled the way they approached you. Fear of rejection. Fear of being exposed. Fear that if they admitted how deeply they cared, you would have the power to hurt them. Fear that their past mistakes would define your future judgment of them. They tried to remain emotionally protected, believing control would keep them safe. Yet every wall they built also prevented you from seeing the love hidden behind it. And eventually, protection began to resemble distance. You felt that distance. There were moments when you questioned whether what you sensed between you was ever real. You wondered whether you had imagined the depth. You may have asked yourself why someone who cared could behave so inconsistently. Those questions did not come because you were foolish. They came because mixed signals create mixed realities. Someone can care deeply and still behave immaturely. Someone can feel love and still be afraid of intimacy. Someone can want connection and still sabotage it when connection becomes emotionally real. That contradiction has been living inside your soulmate. But it is becoming impossible for them to ignore. They have reached a place where they can no longer pretend that the unfinished story between you does not matter. The strange part is that this realization did not make them feel powerful. It humbled them. It forced them to look at something they had avoided for too long. You may have been far more important to them than they ever allowed themselves to admit. And now they are wondering whether you already know. There is something almost cinematic about the way this truth is unfolding. Imagine someone standing alone in a quiet room after everyone else has gone, staring at a message they have typed but not sent. Their thumb hovers over the screen. Their heart argues with their pride. One voice says, "Tell them." Another says, "What if it is too late?" They delete one sentence because it sounds too cold. They rewrite another because it reveals too much. They put the phone down. Pick it back up. Walk away. Return again. The conversation has already begun inside them. You simply have not heard it yet. And the words they are struggling to form are not ordinary words. They are trying to tell you why they pulled away when they wanted closeness. They are trying to explain why they acted unaffected when your absence affected them more deeply than they expected. They want to tell you about the moment they realized they might actually lose access to the version of you that once waited patiently for them. That realization changed something. They started noticing that you were no longer energetically standing in the same place. Even if you still cared, something in you had matured. You stopped needing answers every second. You stopped chasing certainty from someone who could not offer it. You began understanding that love should not require you to abandon your peace. And whether your soulmate consciously recognized this or merely sensed it, your change became a mirror. They could no longer assume you would always be available in the same way. That is why the urgency feels different now. It is not merely, I need to tell them I care. It is, if I do not speak honestly now, I may lose the opportunity to ever be known by them the way I secretly hope to be known. There is another layer, though, and this is where you must remain close. Your soulmate has recently learned something about themselves that they did not expect to confront. They once blamed timing, circumstances, other people, old wounds, or confusion for the distance between you. Some of those things may have genuinely played a role. But they are beginning to see that the greatest obstacle may have been their own fear of receiving something real. Real love is beautiful, but it is also revealing. It exposes where someone still hides. It shows where someone expects abandonment. It reveals where pride has been disguised as independence. It brings old wounds to the surface, not to punish anyone, but because intimacy reaches places casual connections never touch. You reached one of those places inside them. That is why their reaction to you may have felt stronger, stranger, or more contradictory than their reactions to others. You awakened emotions they did not know how to regulate. They wanted closeness, then became overwhelmed by it. They wanted reassurance, yet hesitated to ask. They wanted to feel chosen, while being afraid to fully choose you. Now they can see how exhausting that must have felt from your side. And there is a sentence they have been afraid to admit even to themselves: I expected them to understand me without giving them enough truth to understand. That realization is painful, but it is necessary. You cannot build a future on mind reading. You cannot heal a connection through assumptions. You cannot ask someone to trust feelings you refuse to express. And your soulmate is finally learning this. The urgency is growing because there is something specific they want to correct. A misunderstanding. A moment where you believed one thing because they allowed you to believe it. Perhaps they appeared disinterested when they were overwhelmed. Perhaps they acted as though someone else mattered more than you did. Perhaps they disappeared emotionally instead of admitting that the connection frightened them with its intensity. Perhaps they allowed pride to speak louder than affection. Whatever form it took, they know there is a piece of the story you never received. And without that missing piece, you may have built conclusions that made perfect sense based on what you were shown. This is why they want the conversation. Not simply to change your mind. To finally give you information they should have given you before. But there is still more. They are worried that when they speak, you may listen differently than you once would have. They remember when one honest sentence from them might have restored your hope instantly. Now they sense you have changed. You may still have compassion, but compassion is no longer the same as unlimited access. You may still love deeply, but you are beginning to understand that love without clarity can become emotional fog. Your growth has made their truth more urgent. That does not mean you need to rush. In fact, the message for you is almost the opposite. When this conversation arrives, do not listen only for beautiful words. Listen for responsibility. Listen for consistency. Listen for whether they can describe not only what they feel, but what they understand about what happened. Anyone can say, "I miss you." A deeper awakening sounds like, "I understand why my actions hurt you, and I understand what needs to change." There is wisdom in that difference. Your heart deserves more than emotional intensity. It deserves emotional safety. Still, there is a reason you are being prepared before the conversation. Because what they want to say may genuinely surprise you. They have been hiding a feeling that has existed much longer than you think. At one point, they tried to convince themselves that the connection was temporary. They told themselves they would move on once enough time passed. They believed distractions would eventually erase what they felt. They may even have behaved as though you had become irrelevant. But somewhere along the way, they discovered something uncomfortable. Moving away from you did not erase the connection inside them. It exposed it. Distance removed the noise. And when the noise disappeared, your absence became impossible to misunderstand. They began remembering tiny details. Not only dramatic moments, but insignificant things that only matter when someone has become emotionally important. The way you expressed yourself. The way you responded when they were struggling. Something you laughed about together. A phrase you used. The way you made ordinary moments feel less ordinary. These details kept returning. Not because they were trying to romanticize the past, but because the mind often reveals what mattered after the moment has passed. Then something even more powerful happened. They began comparing how they felt around others with how they felt around you. That comparison did not make them happy. It made them honest. They realized that with many people, they could remain guarded without consequence. With you, they felt seen. And being seen can feel terrifying to someone who has spent years surviving by remaining unreadable. You noticed things. You sensed shifts in their mood. You saw behind certain performances. You could sometimes tell they were hurting even when they insisted they were fine. Part of them loved this. Part of them feared it. Because if you could see through the mask, then eventually you might see the parts of them they had decided were unlovable. This is the hidden fear they want to explain. They did not always pull away because they felt too little. Sometimes they pulled away because they felt too much. But hear this carefully, understanding someone's fear does not require you to excuse every choice they made because of it. Compassion and accountability can exist together. You can understand why someone acted a certain way and still require something healthier moving forward. That balance is part of your preparation. The conversation ahead is not meant to pull you backward into confusion. It is meant to reveal whether something new can actually be built. And your soulmate knows this too. That is why they are afraid of saying the wrong thing. They do not want another half conversation. They do not want to send a vague message that leaves you with more questions than answers. At least, part of them knows that will no longer be enough. They have reached the point where truth must become specific. They want to tell you what happened during a period when you believed they had stopped caring. They want to explain a decision they made that seemed impossible to understand from where you stood. And there is something about that decision you still do not know. This is the revelation they keep circling. Something influenced them. Not necessarily another romantic person, not some dramatic enemy, but a pressure they never told you about. Expectations. Fear. Family opinions. Responsibilities. Their own insecurity. A private situation they thought they had to manage alone. Something made them believe they had to choose silence instead of vulnerability. At the time, they convinced themselves it was the responsible choice. Now they wonder whether it was the greatest emotional mistake they made. They want you to know why. But even that is not the biggest thing they are preparing to admit. The bigger truth is what happened after they stepped back. They expected relief. Instead, they felt absence. At first, they ignored it. They filled their days. They acted normal. They tried not to revisit old conversations. They told themselves they had made the best decision available. Then the quiet moments began. And in those quiet moments, they realized they had not protected themselves from heartbreak. They had simply delayed it. Your absence became louder than your presence had ever been. They began imagining conversations they should have had. They thought about the version of themselves they showed you and the version they wished they had been brave enough to reveal. They wondered whether you thought they never cared. And that question started hurting more than they expected. Because whatever mistakes were made, being remembered by you as someone who felt nothing is not the truth they want to leave behind. They want to correct that. They need you to understand that behind the silence, there was conflict. Behind the distance, there was fear. Behind the strange behavior, there were emotions they had no language for. And beneath all of it was something they were never brave enough to name. Love may be part of that truth. But love is not the entire truth. That is why you should stay with this message. Because the conversation they want is not merely a confession of feeling. It involves a choice. Something in their life is approaching a point where indecision will no longer protect them. They are becoming aware that they cannot keep one foot in the past and one foot in the possibility of you. They cannot continue hiding behind maybe someday. They cannot ask life to preserve an opportunity they refuse to step toward. A decision is forming. And before they make it, they want to know something about you. They want to know whether the door is completely closed. Not because they are entitled to another chance. Not because you owe them access. but because they are finally considering saying what they should have said when they had less to lose. This is what makes the moment so emotionally charged. They are preparing to risk hearing an answer they cannot control. For someone who has protected themselves through avoidance, that is enormous. They may reach out in a way that seems almost casual at first. A simple question. A small message. Something that appears ordinary on the surface. Do not be surprised if the opening does not immediately match the weight of what they are carrying. People who fear vulnerability rarely begin with the deepest sentence. The first words may simply be a doorway. What matters is what follows. Will they stay present when the conversation becomes uncomfortable? Will they answer clearly? Will they acknowledge what happened without turning everything into excuses? Will they make space for your feelings instead of demanding immediate forgiveness? Those are the signs that reveal whether this is merely emotion or genuine growth. Because there is another warning hidden inside this beautiful possibility: urgency can produce honesty, but urgency can also produce promises someone has not yet learned how to keep. So keep your heart open and your wisdom awake. You do not need to punish them. You do not need to rescue them. You only need to listen from the version of yourself who has learned what peace feels like. That version of you will hear what your old self might have missed. And your soulmate senses that change. They know the person they are about to speak to is not exactly the person they once left waiting. You have grown. You have learned. You have survived nights when you thought answers would never come. You learned how to stop demanding closure from someone who could not provide it. You learned how to create peace without receiving every explanation. And now, just when you became capable of living without the conversation may finally be moving toward you. There is something profound about that timing. Sometimes answers arrive after you stop needing them to survive. That is when you can actually hear them clearly. And perhaps that is why this conversation could not have happened earlier. Earlier, you might have accepted words because you were hungry for reassurance. Now you can evaluate them. Earlier, you might have confused chemistry with destiny. Now you understand that connection needs character. Earlier, you may have wanted the person more than you wanted peace. Now you know peace must come with the person, not disappear because of them. That growth changes everything. Your soulmate does not yet fully understand how much you have transformed. And this is where the next revelation becomes important. They are preparing themselves for the possibility that you will not respond the way they imagined. They have pictured you becoming emotional. They have pictured you immediately welcoming them back. They have pictured relief. But another possibility has entered their mind. What if you simply listen calmly? What if you no longer need them to validate your worth? What if the conversation they once controlled through silence is now being held by someone who is no longer afraid of losing them? That thought has humbled them more than anything. Because now they know they must come with truth, not games. They must come with sincerity, not mystery. They must come willing to hear your side too. And there is something you are about to discover that may explain why they have been so restless lately. They already attempted to speak once. Not necessarily directly to you. But the attempt happened. They may have written something and deleted it. They may have opened your contact and closed it. They may have asked someone indirectly about you. They may have rehearsed the conversation with a trusted person. They may have whispered the truth aloud when no one was there. Something has already crossed the boundary between thought and action. The silence is cracking. And once that crack appeared, they could no longer pretend the conversation was optional. This is why the urgency is building now. They are reaching the emotional point where keeping the truth hidden feels dishonest. But the final secret, the one they are most afraid to reveal, is connected to a moment from the past that you interpreted very differently than they did. You thought that moment proved they did not choose you. They remember that same moment as the instant they realized how deeply choosing you could change their entire life. They panicked. They made a decision. And that decision created consequences neither of you fully understood at the time. Now they want to tell you what actually happened inside them during that moment. But before they do, there is one sentence they are struggling to say. A sentence they have carried for far longer than you know. A sentence that begins with an admission. Not, "I miss you." Not, "I still care." Something much deeper. Something that explains the distance, the regret, the urgency, and why your name has suddenly become impossible for them to push away. They have almost said it more than once. And this time, when they finally open that conversation, the first truth may not be the one that changes everything. It is what they are preparing to confess immediately after it that will leave you realizing the story between you was never what you thought it was.